Alzheimer's disease affects millions of people every year. As many as 4 million people in the United States may have this disease. And as our population ages, that number is expected to increase. Anyone who cares for someone with Alzheimer's will be affected and will need to understand how to cope with what is happening. Alzheimer's disease doesn't happen overnight. Slowly, little by little, it sneaks up until one day you realize you can no longer communicate in the same way with the person you've been close to for 40 years. You can't rely on their words, and their sentences don't match the situation. Alzheimer's disease isn't something you can see the way you see a broken arm. Even more confusing is how people with Alzheimer's have good and bad days. The days when they're alert and clear-headed make caregivers hopeful. Then the bad days come, and family members feel the pain of losing their loved one all over again. This slow and normal progression of the disease makes communication a major challenge for caregivers.
Alzheimer's disease affects various parts of the brain. It affects the brain in such a way that people have a difficult time learning new information. This is why, though, that for a long time into the disease, they can remember things that happened a long time ago. They can remember their wedding dates. They can remember the war that they fought in. For most of the people who are caring for World War II. They can remember where they went to high school, but they can't remember the visit that they had with their daughter yesterday. This is because Alzheimer's disease affects certain parts of the brain called the temporal lobes that are responsible for helping us learn new things. The reason that you're able to hold on to the memories that happened a long time ago is because those memories are represented throughout the brain. Those memories don't require just one or two areas of the brain to be there. They're probably represented in multiple systems in the brain. So the disease process has to be quite advanced so that it's attacked the entire brain before we start losing those memories.
What I have is a picture of a normal brain. This is top. This is actually, it's a slice, if you will. Right across, paper-thin slice, looking from the top down. And if you were to look top down, this is a fully functioning brain, totally healthy. The bottom picture is exactly the same slice, except for this comes from somebody who has Alzheimer's. And you can see where there's black holes in that top picture. Those are supposed to be there. In a normal brain, that's empty space, and there's no brain cells in there. It's where your spinal fluid and things come in and out. But on this bottom picture, there's huge black spaces, and that's because so many of the brain cells have died. Now there's nothing there, literally nothing. Nothing to think with, nothing to reason with, and nothing to talk with in that part of the brain. Obviously the whole brain isn't gone, but what Alzheimer's does that is unique to it is it really does affect every area of the brain. There's no place that looks totally healthy anymore. And that's why they have such difficulty.
Hello, I'm Marian Karpinski, and I'll be your host during this program. People who have Alzheimer's can't control what is happening to them. They are not able to change their behavior. We have control over our thoughts and behavior. So as caregivers, we are the ones who must change, learning new ways to relate to the person with Alzheimer's. Understanding the disease will help us develop positive attitudes and more effective communication. People with Alzheimer's only have the present moment. Let them know that you enjoy their company. When caring for someone who has Alzheimer's, the most important thing to take care of is that person's feelings.
When you keep in mind that their feelings are the most important, there's a ton of arguments that you just won't have because that's going to make them upset. There's no point in it. If you keep in mind that a person's feelings are most important, then maybe today you only do half a bath or half a shower and do the other half tomorrow, because right now they're feeling tired of this business. They've had enough. So you say, they're feeling tired, we're done. If you keep their feelings as the guiding light, I want them to be having a good time. it will make a lot of the choices, I think, a lot easier. All the person who has Alzheimer's has is this minute. They can't really remember the minute before. They don't know what's going to happen in the next minute, and they can't do that kind of thinking. So how they feel right now is the most important thing to pay attention to.
One of the questions families most frequently ask is, should I tell the person he or she has Alzheimer's? Keep in mind that the person with Alzheimer's can't reason. They don't have enough memory to remember the question, then think it through to form a conclusion. Caregivers or family members often think that if they tell him that he has Alzheimer's, then he will understand and cooperate. You can't get cooperation by explaining that he has Alzheimer's and expecting him to remember and use that information. A communication problem that frustrates caregivers occurs when it seems as if the person with Alzheimer's is lying. Here is a typical example. A family member calls Dad and asks, "Did you take your medicine today?" Dad replies, "Yes." But when the caregiver goes to visit later, the medication is still in the package, and it's obvious that he hasn't taken his medication for days. An important point to remember about Alzheimer's is that even into the late stages of the disease, people will still respond as they always have to social pleasantries, such as, "How are you? How's it going? Did you take your medicine today?"
When it comes to something as simple as, gosh, I called Mom to remind her to take her medicine, and she told me she did, certainly on the receiving end of that sentence, I mean, it feels like I just got lied to. What really happened is following. If I were to say to you, "How are you today?" Your answer is, "Fine." Like everybody says, "Fine." And we say that answer really without even thinking about it. It just comes out of our head. It's the way we've answered that question a million times. And so fine is what pops out. And it's very similar when you ask an adult, "Are you taking care of yourself? Are you being a grown-up?" Which is essentially, "Did you take your medicine, Mom?" And of course Mom's going to say, "Yes, I'm a grown-up. I know how to take my medicine. Good grief, get back to work and quit worrying about me. Yes." And it just doesn't have a thing to do with whether or not I really walked to the cupboard. The reason it doesn't is that the person who has Alzheimer's cannot. It's not that they're not willing or that they're being deceptive. It's that that person cannot hear the question, hang on to the question long enough to even know what it was, "Did you take your medicine?" and then be able to take into account today. This morning, did I really go into the kitchen, open the cupboard, take out my medicine, and then have my breakfast the way I always do? Or today, did I go outside and pull weeds for a while in the garden, and did I skip breakfast? The person with Alzheimer's cannot take into account today, the current circumstance and the current situation. They simply can't do that.
Communication problems can also occur around visits. A son may visit faithfully every night, but each time he arrives, Mom will say, "You never come to see me." The son may feel that Mom is purposely trying to give him a bad time. The person with Alzheimer's doesn't lay in wait and try to figure out how to hurt your feelings. That's actually complicated thinking that the person with Alzheimer's can't do. It's important not to take what someone with Alzheimer's says personally. She can't always express her feelings accurately. She isn't even aware that she has hurt your feelings. Keep in mind that the person doesn't remember that you visited yesterday. Rather than getting angry or frustrated, use your time together to do something enjoyable.
The person with Alzheimer's disease shows a progression in terms of their problems with language. Very often, the very first sign is problems finding the right words for things. So a person may be talking to you and telling you something about a letter that they received, but they can't get the word envelope out. Or they may point to a lamp and they can't quite get the word lamp out. So language for them starts to become a little disfluent. It is a little difficult for them to find the specific right word that they want to express themselves. Then over time, it moves from that to their language becoming increasingly vague. It is more and more difficult for them to say something specific. If you ask them what they do on a day-to-day basis, what their days are like, often they'll say, oh, you know, I kind of do the same old thing. I kind of sit around a bit. I do house things. But they can't give you very many specific details. And part of that is that their store of language has become affected by the disease. So it is very difficult for them to express themselves in any great detail.
He may substitute words. For example, he asks you to pass the salt when he means to say sugar.
You meant to say sugar. You know, you can get into this issue of nitpicking on accuracy. You meant to say the sugar. So here's the sugar, because I know that's what you meant. Skip the whole conversation. Just get the sugar. There's no gain. You're not going to teach someone how to talk. I think it's rude to ask that person to try a little harder. They're already functioning with half the brain cells that we have. So instead of asking them to try harder or to think it through or to pay attention, skip it. If they point at the sugar and they call it salt, you just hand it over as if they said sugar. That, I think, is the most respectful and the most kind. And then you get to enjoy the person you're with. Instead of arguing, you have a good time.
People with Alzheimer's may ask the same question over and over. Usually the question expresses a concern they have. Anyone with a concern that isn't being addressed will become louder and more persistent. She may repeat the same question because she can't remember that she has just asked it and her concern hasn't gone away. The caregiver's responsibility is to help soothe the worry. The caregiver's goal is not to make the question go away. The caregiver's goal is to make the worry go away for a second or two, and then the question may come back. It's perfectly okay to give the same answer again if it helped to calm her. Certain situations throughout the day will trigger repetitive questions. That's to be expected. It's not the caregiver using poor technique. It's simply the nature of the disease. People with Alzheimer's may become aggressive in response to the environment. Bath time is often when aggressive behavior is displayed. The caregiver's approach may also play a part. Rushing, speaking harshly, or forcing the person may result in an aggressive response. When someone with Alzheimer's displays aggressive behavior, it is a form of communication. It may be the only way a person has left to say, "Pay attention to me. I don't want to take a bath." When someone is communicating vigorously, our job is to respect their communication. Hitting, kicking, or biting are ways of saying stop. The appropriate response is to stop. That doesn't mean we don't try again in 5 minutes or a half hour.
Now, some of the things you might try are in fact different ways of communicating what you need. Often, people who have Alzheimer's don't do well with a verbal explanation. For example, "It's time to take your bath. I'm willing to help you. Let's go." You know, it's lovely, it's short and sweet, but the words are going to just fly right through. With Alzheimer's, no matter what chore you're wanting to address, the way to communicate it is often by not talking about it at all, and instead using some gestures. And then after that, use body language. So I don't care whether I'm wanting to go to the kitchen or the bathroom or the shower or out the front door, but once I have some eye contact and a nice feeling connection, then you can use body language to communicate what you need. And without saying why or where, you just get the movement. So you use body language, you use a connection that's nonverbal, and then go where you need to go. So that's the first part. Now, for some people, a distraction is going to be a good way to get the chore done. Kind of a different communication style, but you don't want to talk about things that are distressing. I know one woman that if we start singing, in her, when she's sitting, when she's relaxed in the living room, just start singing because she loves to sing. And then do the body language and keep her singing. She can take a bath or a shower, it doesn't matter which, because she's really not paying attention to the chore that she doesn't like. She's singing.
Typically, there are some very important things that are still getting through in terms of communicating with someone even who has very impaired language skills. So even to the very end, the person can understand tone of language, so that something that is said with a loving tone is understood quite a bit differently than something that is said with a harsh tone. The person can catch those sorts of social differences in terms of the use of language. They can also understand body posture. So when we're saying something to someone that we really care about, we lean forward, we sort of soften our posture versus sitting back and crossing our arms and being more distant. So that's a difference also that stays late into the disease process. So even if they're not understanding the specific words, they're often understanding the context that the communication takes place in. What you want to do for effective communication is to use a variety of cues to get the person to have a chair. You might pull up a chair beside that chair and sit down as you're saying it, because that's a typical social cue. When one person sits down in a friendly situation, the other person usually sits down. So what you're trying to do is to maximize the odds that they're going to catch your meaning. And you do that by setting up the social setting. You do that with physical cue and touching, and then you do it by using simple words and simple phrases.
Avoid the use of negative words when communicating with someone who has Alzheimer's. Words like no, don't, or can't create resistance. Let's eat later is a more positive expression than don't eat now. You messages can put people on the defensive. Using I messages along with an enjoyable distraction and gestures is more effective than you messages. Instead of using messages such as you're up too early, you need to go to bed, try leading with statements such as I'd like a little snack before I go to bed. I'm getting sleepy. Then follow that with gestures. Even when people with Alzheimer's can no longer talk or have trouble finding words to form sentences, they can usually still sing a song. Often they can remember the lyrics of the song from beginning to end. Many Alzheimer's patients can still read as well. Singing and reading can give the person great joy, and hearing a loved one's voice can be very comforting for family members.
I ask caregivers to never talk down to the individual with Alzheimer's disease. I ask them never to baby talk. The fact that you are having problems with language does not mean that talking to them like a 4-year-old is going to help with that. It just doesn't. So the communication should still be adult to a respected older adult. And so baby talk doesn't work neurologically, and it's insulting. So that's the first thing I ask people not to do. I ask them to shorten their sentences. I ask them to use a lot of visual cues and social cues. Again, instead of, we were thinking about having a cup of tea this afternoon. Would you like a cup of tea? I think you liked that at one time. You simply sit down at the table, you have a couple of cups of tea, and you say, please sit down. You just make it very simple and create sort of a social understanding around what it is that you want to get across.
People with Alzheimer's often ask about people who have passed away years ago. Where's Mom? Where's Fred? It is not helpful to remind her that Mom or Fred has died. Rather than avoid the subject, pursue the memory. You can say, she's not here right now, but tell me about your mom. Often the person with Alzheimer's is looking for the sensations and security that they would have if Mom or Fred were here. As caregivers, we need to help this person feel comfortable, safe, and protected. Elderly women who have had children commonly ask, where are my babies? This question will often come up at mealtime when feeding the children was an important part of motherhood. Find a way to soothe their concern. You could say, the babies are sleeping. Remember that trying to bring the person with Alzheimer's back to present-day reality is not effective. We need to adapt to his or her reality. It's okay to go anywhere in any time period in order to communicate.
One of the questions that family members and care providers ask fairly frequently is, how often should I visit, or should I visit at all, the loved one with Alzheimer's disease? They don't seem to be understanding what we're saying. Most of the time they don't seem to recognize me. So should I visit? And I think the answer to that is you should visit because it's important to you. You should visit because they may catch some things on some days. And just if you can make the interaction within that moment pleasant, regardless if they're understanding a lot of the words, did they enjoy the activity? Were you able to sit down with them? Were you able to share a meal with them?
Communication amongst family becomes particularly difficult when the person who has Alzheimer's doesn't recognize family members anymore. And in that situation, a spouse or children can think, it doesn't do any good for me particularly to go talk to the person. Anybody could go talk to my dad because he doesn't know who I am. But I would disagree with that. There is a richness, even though it's going to be way different, there's a richness that happens because of our history together that can only come from people that have been family or friends for a long, long time. And I just want to share a story about one couple in particular where the wife was really agonizing because he didn't remember her. He didn't know who she was. And what I did, I had them sit down together and I asked him about his wife, Esther. Your wife's name was Esther? And he said, yes. And I said, tell me about Esther. Well, then he just overflowed with how Esther was the love of his life and nobody could ever be like Esther, and no matter what, Esther made everything right, and how she'd been a great mother. Well, here's Esther sitting right next to him, and she started to sob. Hearing the things about herself that were so precious, she started to cry. He didn't know who was sitting next to her. He didn't recognize her for the Esther, his wife. But he did know there was a woman sitting next to him who was crying, and he put his arm around her in the sweetest way and he was consoling her. And in its own very unique way, it was a way for them to have communication about the current grief. It was a way for her to get some real consolation from him. He could give that to her. I can tell you need me, and I know how to help you. And he could do that out of instincts and a lifetime of history together. That's a kind of communication we can get from the person who has Alzheimer's by using their strength, and their strength is their old memories. They can talk about the old family vacation. They can share those really precious memories, and I think for family members to be able to hear those things is a worthwhile gift to share, and no one else can do that.
The communication tips presented in this program will help you to communicate more effectively with someone who has Alzheimer's. One of the best ways to learn more communication tips is to join a support group. You can learn a great deal by sharing and listening to others who are going through a similar experience. Even though the person with Alzheimer's can no longer talk to you and understand what you are saying as well as he or she used to, there are still other ways you can enjoy your time together. When you let go of some of the issues of language, you can enjoy the experiences you have with that person, and you can meet his or her needs more effectively. There's beauty in simplicity and being in the present moment. The person with Alzheimer's needs your presence, a loving touch, a fun activity, or a reminder of something in the past. Not a lot of words. That is how you communicate with someone who has Alzheimer's.